Paul McGuire is a reformed criminal turned successful businessman. When his teenage daughter is kidnapped and brutally murdered, Paul is drawn back into his violent past. Believing that Russian mobsters are behind the attack, he reunites with his old crew to seek revenge. As Paul spirals deeper into a cycle of rage and vengeance, he uncovers shocking truths that force him to confront his own past and the consequences of his actions. The movie starts with a man named Paul, who goes to pick up his daughter Caitlin from school. Caitlin is happy to see her dad as she walks out of the building. They chat as they head to the car, catching up on how her day went. Paul gently reminds Caitlin to focus on her schoolwork, knowing she's been a bit distracted lately. Caitlin nods and says she's doing fine. She then excitedly tells Paul that two of her friends are coming over to hang out that evening. Paul, wanting to make sure they have a good time, suggests they stop at the store to buy some snacks. Paul is a successful businessman who has built a thriving construction empire in Mobile, Alabama. His hard work and dedication have made him well respected in the community. He has two close friends, Danny and Kane, who have been by his side through thick and thin. Kane, who owns a popular local pub, is someone Paul can always count on. In fact, Paul has already made plans to celebrate his daughter Caitlin's 16th birthday at Kane's pub, knowing it will be the perfect spot for the occasion. After a long day at work, Paul heads home to his wife, Vanessa. She's waiting for him as they prepare for an important charity dinner that evening. Vanessa, elegant and poised, greets Paul warmly, and they chat about their plans for the evening while getting ready. Meanwhile, Caitlin is relaxing in the lounge with two of her friends, Ivan and Mike. When Paul arrives home, he greets them and quickly joins the conversation. As they chat, Paul offers Mike a job at his construction company for next summer, a generous gesture that excites Mike. Afterward, Paul asks Evan if he can give him a hand with some boxes by the counter. Once they're in the kitchen, away from everyone else, Paul takes a moment to have a more serious conversation with Mike. He tells him to be careful with Caitlin, hinting that he knows about Evan's growing interest in his daughter. Instead of being protective, Paul encourages Mike, telling him it would be a good idea to ask Caitlin out. Mike seems surprised but nods, taking Paul's words to heart. Shortly after, Vanessa steps into the kitchen, reminding the group to behave while she and Paul are at the charity dinner. After the charity dinner, Vanessa and Paul realize it's getting late and decide they should head home. Suddenly, Mobile PD Detective St. John approaches Paul with a serious expression. Surprised by the unexpected appearance, Paul politely tells the detective to come back later, explaining that they're in the middle of an important evening. However, Detective St. John doesn't back down. His voice becomes firm as he tells Paul that something has happened to Caitlin. After hearing the terrible news, Paul and Vanessa rush home, their hearts racing with worry. When they arrive, they find the house in a mess, furniture is knocked over, glass is broken, and the front door is wide open. Inside, Ivan and Mike are talking to the police, looking pale and shaken. As soon as Paul walks in, Mike tells him what happened. He and Ivan were watching TV with Caitlin when several masked men suddenly burst into the house. They tried to fight the men off, but there were too many. The men overpowered Mike and Evan, and before they knew it, Caitlin had been taken. Paul feels a wave of shock and fear wash over him. The thought of his daughter being in danger is terrifying. He struggles to stay calm but can't hide how worried he is. He asks the police what they know. Detective St. John steps forward and tries to reassure them. He tells Paul and Vanessa that the police will do everything they can to find Caitlin and bring her back home safely. The next day, Paul decides he can't just wait for the police to find Caitlin. He feels a strong need to take action and goes to meet Mike. When he arrives, he asks Mike if he can remember anything about the kidnappers, their faces, voices, or any details that could help. However, Mike looks stressed and overwhelmed. He shakes his head, saying he can't recall anything specific right now. Paul can see how pressured Mike feels, so he takes a deep breath and tries to be understanding. He hands Mike his phone number, telling him to call if he remembers anything, no matter how small. After meeting with Mike, Paul decides to visit his close friends Danny and Kane to update them on the situation. When he arrives, he explains everything that has happened, his voice filled with urgency and worry. To show how serious he is, he offers them $200,000 in exchange for their help during this difficult time. Danny and Kane listen intently, but after a moment, they both shake their heads and reject the offer. They assure Paul that they care deeply about Caitlin and will do everything in their power to help find her, no money needed. Their loyalty and friendship mean a lot to Paul, and he feels a sense of relief knowing they're by his side. Meanwhile, Paul becomes convinced that Caitlin's kidnapping is a long overdue retaliation for the crimes he committed in his youth. Distrustful of the police, he decides to ignore their efforts and launch his own investigation. He digs into his past, looking for any connections that could explain why this is happening now. The next morning, one of the detectives visits Paul with news that shakes him to his core. They've found Caitlin. Hope surges within him, but it quickly turns to despair when the detective reveals the devastating truth. Caitlin's body has been discovered in a storm drain. The news hits Paul like a brick wall, shattering his heart and extinguishing any hope he had left. In the days that follow, a funeral is held for Caitlin. Family and friends gather to mourn the loss of a bright young girl with so much potential. Paul stands by the casket, heartbroken, feeling as if a piece of him has been ripped away. The pain of losing his daughter weighs heavily on him, and he struggles to find a way to cope with the unbearable reality of her absence. After her funeral, Paul meets his former mob boss, O'Connell, who strongly suggests that Paul allow the police to handle the investigation, reasoning that Paul was allowed to walk out of the mob and therefore he should stay away from mob methods. It is revealed that Paul Maguire, along with his close friends Kane and Danny, once lived a dangerous life as members of the Irish mob. They were deeply involved in the world of crime, always looking for the next big score. One fateful night, they made a bold move to ambush a Russian mobster who was on his way to deliver money to his boss. The three friends intercepted the mobster, and to their surprise, they found much more than they had anticipated. Along with a Russian TT pistol, they managed to escape with a briefcase filled with cash, an amount that was far greater than they ever imagined. This windfall was more than enough for Paul to leave the life of crime behind and go legitimate. However, their heist ignited a violent war between their Irish crime family and the Russian mob, leading to bloodshed on both sides. Knowing the danger that their actions had created, Paul instructed Kane and Danny to hide the money until tensions settled down. Despite the casualties and chaos that followed, their plan worked better than expected. 5 years after the robbery, the three friends finally gathered to split the money. It was a tense reunion, but they were relieved to see they had survived the war. Over the next 20 years, Paul used his share wisely, investing in legitimate ventures and gradually building a successful construction empire. He married Vanessa during this time, and together they created a life that was a far cry from the criminal past that Paul had left behind. The transition wasn't easy, but Paul was determined to leave his old life behind and build a better future for himself and his family. Paul and his friends, Kane and Danny, gathered to discuss the possibility of someone seeking revenge for their past crimes. Despite the tension in the room, Paul dismisses their concerns, reminding them that the events happened many years ago and doubting that anyone would come after them now. Later, feeling restless, Paul decides to go through Vanessa's belongings in her room. As he sorts through her papers, he discovers an assignment she had been working on for her class. Recognizing the effort she put into it, Paul feels a surge of pride for Vanessa and her dedication to their daughter, Caitlin. Determined to honor Caitlin's memory, Paul decides to submit the paper to Caitlin's teacher. He knows this is an important way to acknowledge his daughter's hard work. When he arrives at the school, he meets with Caitlin's teacher, who listens attentively as Paul explains the situation. The teacher takes the paper with a sympathetic expression, clearly moved by Caitlin's loss. She acknowledges Caitlin's dedication as a student and expresses her admiration for her efforts. Paul leaves the school feeling a small sense of comfort, knowing that Caitlin's hard work will be recognized, even in her absence. After submitting Caitlin's paper, Paul and his friends, Kane and Danny, set out on a mission to track down anyone who might be connected to Chernov, the legendary mob boss whose money they stole 17 years earlier. Convinced that Chernov is somehow involved in Caitlin's murder, they resort to intimidation tactics, shaking down and roughing up anyone they can find for information. Their actions become increasingly aggressive as they push deeper into the criminal underworld. Meanwhile, O'Connell, Paul's former mob boss, pleads with him to stop this violent rampage. He warns Paul that his reckless behavior will only lead to more danger and chaos. However, Paul is consumed by grief and anger, refusing to heed O'Connell's advice. He feels justified in his actions, believing that he must find those responsible for his daughter's death. Vanessa, who initially supported her husband's quest for justice, also begins to worry about the person he is becoming. She sees the darkness in his eyes and fears that he is reverting to the violent man he once was. After Paul and his friends execute some of Chernov's men and destroy their businesses, Chernov retaliates. The first target is Kane. As Russian mobsters enter his pub, Kane hides, quickly loading his gun, and calls Paul to warn him. Paul immediately heads toward the pub and tries to contact Danny, but gets no response. Meanwhile, Kane is captured by the Russians and taken hostage. Paul follows their car but is soon stopped by the police. Detective Peter lets him go but warns him to stop causing trouble. When Kane is captured by Chernov's men, he endures brutal torture in an attempt to get Chernov to confess to killing Caitlin as revenge for the heist from years ago. Chernov is taken aback by Kane's accusations, angered not only by the confrontation but also by the revelation that the Russian mobster they killed during the robbery was his brother. Meanwhile, Paul becomes suspicious of Danny, believing he may have spilled information. Danny is back working for O'Connell, and with his drug use and party lifestyle, Paul fears he might have talked while under the influence and not even remember doing so. In a fit of rage, Paul confronts Danny, accusing him of being a traitor. The argument escalates quickly, with tempers flaring. Danny strikes Paul, pushing him over the edge. In a moment of blind fury, Paul retaliates and fatally stabs Danny with a knife. As he stands over Danny's lifeless body, a wave of regret washes over him. He realizes the irreversible nature of his actions, but it's too late to turn back now. Meanwhile, after Kane's brutal death, Chernov arranges a meeting with O'Connell to discuss the situation. He reveals Paul's involvement in igniting the long-standing gang war that has caused so much pain for both sides. Chernov believes that O'Connell should take responsibility for Paul's actions. However, O'Connell is dismissive, refusing to entertain Chernov's claims based on general principles. He firmly states that he has no business with Paul and his friends anymore and is unwilling to get involved in the conflict. Tensions rise during the meeting, and a fight quickly breaks out. In the ensuing shootout, bullets fly, and when the dust settles, Chernov stands as the only survivor, having eliminated O'Connell and his men. On the other hand, Paul returns home and unexpectedly discovers a Tokarev pistol hidden in his closet. This weapon is a relic from the robbery that initiated the gang war years ago. As he examines the pistol, memories flood back. After some time, a realization strikes him about the interconnectedness of his past actions and their consequences. Meanwhile, Mike receives a text message from Ivan, prompting him to meet. When Mike finds Ivan, he apologizes to him and leaves quickly. Shortly after, Mike finds Paul waiting for him, holding the Tokarev pistol. As Paul points the gun at Mike, he instinctively raises his hands, urging Paul to stop. Then, Mike decides to come clean. He prepares to reveal everything he knows about the events that have led them to this point. Paul finally gets the real story from Mike. He tells him that they were drinking and horsing around with his guns that night and Mike accidentally shot his daughter. They panicked and then created the kidnapping story considering Paul's criminal past. Paul is shocked to hear this and after an inner struggle, Paul allows Mike to live and walks away. Returning home, Paul phones his wife, apologizing and saying things will be over soon, as Chernov and some of his surviving men enter his house. He then tells her the story about the first time he killed a person when someone gave him a knife in a bar fight. He stabs himself as he watches men entering the room with guns pointed at him. Suddenly, Paul is shot and killed. After some time, Vanessa reaches home only to witness policemen taking out Paul's body with teary eyes. This is where the movie ends. If you like this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications, so you can watch more movies like this. Thanks for watching.